Warhammer 40,000 Space Marine, a game I've seen claimed in various spots on the internet as one of the better Warhammer games. I decided to test that claim for myself in this review. Space Marine was released in 2011 and developed by Relic Entertainment, known for their company Heroes and Dawn of War franchises. It was published by THQ, although THQ went bankrupt in 2013, and the rights were sold to Sega, who still currently holds them. Warhammer 40,000 Space Marine is a third-person shooter slash hack and slash game in a very similar vein to games like Gears of War.
Try to keep up.
Now, before going further in this review, Warhammer 40,000 is a setting in which galaxy-wide human empire that, in order to maintain itself and prevent the human race from going extinct, basically is turned into a mixture of an overzealous Catholic Church, a la the Inquisition, and space Nazis, in order to fight a nasty collection of baddies like rampaging space orcs, giant bugs that eat everything in sight, blue smurf space commies, which just sounds awful, and the forces of hell itself, and their mortal servants. Now in this game, as the title suggests, you play a Space Marine, basically an autistic super soldier that is both the first and last line of defense for the Imperium of Man. The one you play as in particular is Captain Titus of the Ultramarines, sent to the world Graia, however you pronounce it, to defend the world from an orc invasion, with this planet being particularly important due to the fact that the planet is one giant factory dedicated to the production of titans. Basically, think Gundams on steroids. Now, with introductions out of the way, let's get into talking about the game's visuals. In the time that it came out, it was a pretty decent looking game, although nowadays it's really starting to show its age, and it's a very mixed bag at that. Some of the character models, for example, like Captain Titus, look pretty decent and even have decent reflective qualities and effects to them, with armor shining in the sunlight or reflecting explosions and the like. However, others, like the rookie character Leandros, for example, the texture work is very pixelated. This is especially noticeable when he's up close in cutscenes. I don't know if this is due to the game running in resolutions that it wasn't really intended for at the time of release. For example, I'm running it in 1080p. I would imagine this would be even more noticeable if you were running in 4K. But it could also be the game is just starting to have issues running on modern hardware as well. In my time messing with various settings, I was never able to figure it out. Now, a lot of the effects in the game actually look really well done. The explosions, the gunfire, all looks pretty good, and there's nothing that stood out as bad to me. There's a lot of nice touches with it too, like the smoke rising from barrels after you've stopped firing. The environments, however, are also another mixed bag. Some look really good, and I have a feeling part of this has to do with the game's fairly strong lighting system, while others look really bland, and the geometry seems fairly basic. For example, some of the buildings in the background can look really flat and almost something I'd expect to see on an original Xbox or GameCube game, while others just look pretty good for their time. So all in all, visually, it's a mixed bag from pretty decent to very much showing its age, but nothing absolutely terrible or ugly. Now, the animations are probably one of the better things presentation-wise in the game, whether it be the executions, reloading animations during cutscenes. It's all either good or just outright fantastic. There's a lot of nice touches to them too, and absolutely nothing looks terrible. This is also aided by the fact that, especially on modern systems, you're going to be able to run this game completely maxed out at 60 FPS or even higher, with no issues whatsoever. Now, the audio in the game is less of a mixed bag. All the sound effects are pretty stellar. There wasn't a single weapon sound, for example, that sounded off or weak to me, whether it be the bolters or the plasma guns or even the las rifle. All sounded absolutely great. And in the middle of busier encounters, combat can sound absolutely chaotic, which is how 40K should be. However, for the most part, the layering of the sound effects is good enough that you can still distinctly hear things that you need to be aware of, like the clicking of the suicide enemies, for example. Now, the voice work is pretty decent. Nothing stands out as terrible and no one sounds out of place. And I can't say for certain, but I'm pretty sure I recognize some of the character voices from actors that have done audiobook recordings and audio dramas produced by Black Library. So if you're like me and you listen to those, it's a nice touch and all the characters feel like they should belong.
This is your plan.
We need to get to the surface to take out the gun battery. Or do you want to go home already, Sergeant?
Not before having a word or two with the orcs.
The only issue I have with the voice work is when there's a lot of orcs and they do their roars or war cries, it can sound kind of off. It's kind of hard to describe. It's like it's not layered correctly. Here's an example of that now. It just sounds kind of weird to me. Now, the music in the game, while not bad and nothing sounded out of place, doesn't really stand out to me at all. Nothing caught my attention or really seemed recognizable, and at least for me, when I could hear the music, it sounded very similar to generic action movie or Marvel superhero movie music. However, a lot of the time at the game's default sound settings, I had a hard time hearing the music at all whenever I was in one of the larger combat encounters, which in this game there's a decent number of them, so outside of cutscenes and the quieter bits, you're not gonna hear it a whole lot. So all in all, the audio's pretty good. Nothing really to complain about, and the presentation of the game as a whole is pretty good. Really stands out in the cutscenes, which are fairly well done. There's a lot of good moments of decent cinematography, and even a couple instances where there's shots in a scene that instead of transitioning to another shot, will pan the camera and zoom in or zoom out and do focus effects, giving it a one-shot impression, which you don't really see too often in any media, and no one really capitalized on it until games like Metal Gear Solid 5 and Death Stranding were released. And it's always an effect I really like seeing, and I wish more stuff would do it more often. And now, moving on to the most important part of the game, the gameplay itself. For the most part, the gameplay is fairly decent for a game from its time. If you've played something like Gears of War, as mentioned before, you kind of know what you're in for. Linear combat-focused gameplay. However, it does a thing that wasn't really common at the time, and it mixes up ranged combat with a focus on melee combat as well. And there's really not a whole lot of issues with it until you start to get to the end of the game, and then its shortcomings really start to become apparent, but I'll talk a bit more on that later. First up, I'll focus on the controls. They're fairly solid and responsive, and pretty much function and laid out exactly like you would expect your average run-of-the-mill third-person shooter. Melee combat's a bit different. You have one button for your standard melee hits, where you can have up to like a 4 or 5 hit combo depending upon the melee weapon you're using, and there's also another key to do a stun hit that you use at the end of your combos, and some of these can be area of effect, where you knock multiple enemies down and cause an opponent to become stunned, whereupon then you can hit a third key to activate a synced up execution kill animation, which is your only means of recovering your health in this game, aside from dying and starting back at a checkpoint. And this is a thing you have to use fairly tactically, because you can still take damage while you're doing it and even be killed. The game, like most of its time, ever since Halo was released, utilized a shield that recharges with a health system, although in my personal experience, I feel like the shield recharges too slowly and probably doesn't have enough hit points to it. For the most part, the combat's solid, but the game really needed a cover system, and that really rears its ugly head once you get towards the end of the game. You have decent enemy variety, with a couple different variants of both ranged and melee enemies from the orcs, although after a while, they kind of start to get old, and there's no real visual variety. All the melee orcs look exactly the same. All the orcs with guns look exactly the same. Unless they're an actual different type, they're all pretty much identical clones of each other, which could have at least If they had put some variety, at least make it feel different, even if it actually isn't. They do try to alleviate this by like the last third or fourth of the game by introducing a new enemy faction. However, that's when the game's problems really start to arise, as a lot of the combat encounters there, the arenas tend to be wide open spaces, and the enemies take a lot of damage and can spam projectiles and grenades at you, and with no cover system it starts to become a very big problem. The damage they do seems overpowered, and the weapons at this point just feel completely underwhelming. This is probably the biggest fault of the game overall, is the last third kind of bogs down the game and makes it feel like it's longer than it should and goes on for too long due to the constant large-scale encounters you have where you're outnumbered, outgunned, and dealing with just complete damage sponges for enemies that can kill you in just a lot of the times just a couple of shots. Now, there is a decent weapon variety, such as you have a bolt pistol, which is a basic pistol like most games, and you have unlimited ammo for. The bolt rifle, which is your typical assault rifle. There's also a plasma pistol, a plasma rifle. You get a melt-a-gun, which is basically a shotgun in this. There's your las rifle and stalker bolt rifle, I believe it's called. Name escapes me at the moment. Which are basically two variants of the sniper rifle, the las one being way more powerful, and for the most part actually able to one-shot the vast majority of enemies if you land a headshot. There's also a nice feature with the sniper rifles where when you do line up a headshot with your scope, a little skull icon pops up to let you know that. Overall, there's decent weapon variety, and throughout the game you often get upgrades to the already existing weapons, such as the plasma pistol being an upgraded version of the bolt pistol that actually has utility all the way to the end game. It has a decent damage output for its regular shots, but it can also charge up a shot that once landed will stick to an enemy and then explode a second or two later, and has a good AoE effect to it too, so you can disrupt crowds with it and isolate opponents. You can also get grenades, which are decent enough, although towards the end of the game, due to the new enemy types, become fairly useless, except for the melee focused ones. The upgrades you get for the rifles, outside of the las rifle, due to the high health pools of the enemies, seem like they almost do absolutely nothing. It really seems like one of the biggest issues of the last part of the game is balance is just completely thrown out the window. It's not impossible, but it's very frustrating. You also, through a good part of the game, get two AI companions with you, Leandros and Sidonis. I haven't mentioned them up to this point, and I'm just mentioning them here for the sake of it, because they're largely useless. Their AI doesn't seem very intelligent, and they largely just stand in place and occasionally shoot, and a lot of the time the enemy doesn't really focus on them very much, largely just gunning for you. Thankfully, melee weapons don't have this issue as much, with each new melee weapon feeling like an incremental upgrade. There are 4 melee weapons in total, starting with the knife, then the chainsaw sword, the force axe, and the thunder hammer. Each new weapon adds more steps to the combos that you can perform, with the exception of the thunder hammer, which only has 3 hits, and oftentimes there are points in the game where you get to choose between the different melee weapons. However, I feel like it's a false choice, because once you get the force axe and thunder hammer made available to you, you pretty much should always stick with those, only swapping back and forth between the two depending upon the encounter you're going into. This is due to the thunder hammer, despite being able to kill even the endgame enemies in just a couple of hits, is very slow and only has 3 hits in its combos. And last but not least, there's the jump pack, which, unlike most games, instead of just being a traversal tool, it's also utilized as a weapon, where you jump up in the air and then slam back down to the ground, causing massive amounts of damage, and having a pretty high AoE area, where you can completely destroy and disrupt crowds. However, the only downside of the jump pack is you only get it in a couple set-piece segments that do not last very long. There is also a rage mode that you can activate, that you get incremental upgrades, such as giving you the ability to go into slow-mo, or lasting longer. It does allow your health to recharge while you're doing it. However, like the executions, you have to use it tactically. There were some cases where I activated it when I was in trouble, and just due to the nature of the enemies in the end game, as soon as the mode exited, I was immediately killed. Because even though your health recharges, you still do take damage, just can't die outright. Thankfully though, unlike other games, it actually refills pretty quickly. Doesn't take very long to build it up, so you can use it again, provided you can stay alive if you're caught in situations where you have multiple of the larger enemies in the end game attacking you at once. So last but not least, let's get into the story. Now, in case anybody's watching this who hasn't played the game and doesn't want spoilers, go to this point so you can skip them. I'll give you a second. Alright, so you and your two Space Marine buddies decide to jump down onto the world from your ship, whereupon you land on the Orc War Boss's ship, you take it down, crash land, go along, find the rookie character Leandros, meet up with some Imperial Guard soldiers, carry on, meet up with the older sergeant, then you meet up with the rest of the Imperial Guard. They tell you your characters about the big gun that needs to get taken down. You go take it down, then you move on to getting to the actual Titan factory, the whole point of coming to the planet in the first place. Outside the factory itself, you find a servo skull, where it's revealed that the Imperial Inquisition is on the planet, and that there's some sort of super weapon that needs to be recovered before the orcs can get their hands on it. So you make your way to the Inquisitor. He reveals that it's not only a weapon, but a power source and is powering the factory. You get down to the energy reactor, where the artifact is, battle a bunch of orcs, and then when you get to claim it, come to find out that it's somehow utilizing warp energies, much to the dismay of the Ultramarines, and the rookie gets immediately suspicious as to Captain Titus being able to grab it and not suffer any of the ill effects of being exposed to chaos.
The Codex Astartes warns that those in league with Chaos can withstand the warp's touch.
The Inquisitor then explains that the weapon can be used and attuned to destroy a specific race when it's fired, so they come up with a plan in order to destroy the Orc army attacking the planet that they will use the weapon. So you battle your way to the spire where it can be used in the Inquisitor's labs. This is where one of the worst points in the game is, in my opinion, where you go down hallways filled with turrets that do an insane amount of damage. So you get to the point where you can fire the weapon, but when you do, it goes wrong, and Chaos Space Marines and demons invade, where it is then revealed that this was all set up by the Inquisitor, who's actually been possessed by some sort of demonic spirit for the Chaos Space Marine warlord, and then a demonic invasion occurs. So then Captain Titus takes the warp artifact, decides to make his way to the Titan, and use the warp artifact to power up the Titan so it can launch its weapon and destroy the spire. You battle through hordes of enemies and damage sponge flying drones to achieve this, and then when you do, the greater attempt at the Chaos Invasion is ceased. However, the enemy forces are still on the planet. A giant batch of Space Marines arrive on the planet as reinforcements. You push your way across a bridge, and you make your way to the top of the spire thereafter. Once you get up there, you fight a bunch of enemies. You get to the last boss encounter where the Warlord is, whereupon instead of having an actual boss fight, you instead just fight 3 waves of enemies. Then quick time event, you smash his head as you both tumble down to the floor. It's then revealed that Titus is still alive after that, but before he can get too far along in celebrating his victory, the actual Inquisition shows up, claims Titus a heresy, where it's revealed that the rookie Leandros has betrayed him and ratted him out.
His injuries appear chaos inflicted. You are certain of this charge?
Captain Titus has been corrupted by Chaos, Inquisitor Thrax.
I am no heretic.
And he is taken away, kind of to set up a sequel that would never arrive. And that's the story of Space Marine in a nutshell. So in conclusion, is Space Marine the best Warhammer game, or one of the best? Probably now at this point, no, but it is definitely one of the better ones that's not a strategy game, but at this point, games like Vermintide have probably surpassed it in fun factor. There is a multiplayer component to the game, but I was never able to find a match in it. Maybe there's a Discord group somewhere you can find to get into the multiplayer, but I wouldn't recommend going out of my way for it. After playing through the campaign, I kind of just wanted to put the game up and be done with it. It was a good game up until you get to the last third, where the second enemy faction arrives. It really does feel like balance got thrown out the window, and I have a feeling this might be due to the fact that THQ, the publisher at the time, was falling into financial ruin and probably rushed the game out before it was ready to be released. All in all, it's a good game, but it sits in a weird spot. I can't really recommend it to people who are new coming into 40k, as the game doesn't really explain the universe or set up anything very well. And at this point, most people who are into 40k have probably already played it, and for people who like action games, well, there's better elsewhere that do very similar things. The main appeal of it is just to get a ground level view of some of the locations and characters that can exist in the 40k universe. And so if you're someone who's going to buy it, I would recommend to waiting till it's on sale. Even though it's not very expensive now, I don't quite feel like at this point it's worth that price. The game is really only about 6 or 7 hours. Maybe that'll get padded out more on higher difficulties just with the sheer amount of deaths you will experience, but I don't really consider deaths and unbalanced difficulty as being things that should get factored into game length. So if you're gonna get it, wait for a sale. Anyways, that's been my review for Warhammer 40,000 Space Marine. If you liked the video and want to see more reviews, please like and subscribe. Hit the little bell notification if you would. And any questions, comments, concerns, criticisms, please leave a comment below. Have a nice day.